In the early 1800s, medical science was at a standstill. The study of the human body was being stopped by the strict laws that prohibited the use of cadavers that weren't executed criminals. These laws were broken when two men, named William Burke and William Hare, murdered and sold innocents for profit. While this was most definitely a tragedy, triumph did come from it, as laws, such as the Anatomy Act of 1832, were changed and passed that allowed scientists to delve into research of the human body.
The year is 1829. The setting is Edinburgh, Scotland. A man by the name of William Burke was just hung after being found guilty of 16 counts of murder. His partner in crime, William Hare, had turned him in because he didn't want to go down the same path.
Let's start at the beginning. How did it get this far? In January of 1828, the need for cadavers in the scientific world was reaching an all-time high. The scientific boom of the 19th century made it to where the demand far outweighed the supply of cadavers.
People needed cadavers to learn more about the human body and surgery, as well as medicines. This shortage of bodies was holding society back from human discovery.
William Burke and William Hare were renting out a lodging house to gain extra money when tragedy struck. An elderly man who was staying at the house passed away. He hadn't paid the rent, and they were in desperate need of money. This tragic event began what would later be known as the Burke and Hare murders, or the Westport murders.
To gain back the money they had lost on the man, they decided to sell his body to Dr. Robert Knox, a lecturer on anatomy in Britain, as well as the creator of the theory of transdental anatomy. He paid them between 8 to 10 pounds and thanked them for their cadaver.
Burke and Hare found this very promising. They did little to no work and were able to collect a good amount of money. Burke declared, "We will make it our business to look out for persons to decoy into our houses to murder them."
While they committed 16 murders in all, some murders were more well documented than others. They are as follows.
Abigail Simpson was murdered in February of 1828. She was an elderly woman whom the pair had invited to stay at the lodging house. They got her drunk, but made the mistake of getting drunk themselves, as they passed out and slept the night away. In the morning, they offered her whiskey to cure her hangover, and got her drunk enough to pass out. They then smothered her to death and brought her body to Dr. Knox. He paid them 10 pounds.
Mary Patterson and Janet Brown were 18-year-old prostitutes who were invited to breakfast at Burke's house on April 9th. Soon after, Patterson had passed out, but Brown was holding her liquor well. Burke then took Brown to a tavern to get her drunk there. She still wasn't drunk, and so Burke took her back to Hare's Lodge, where Helen McDougall, Burke's mistress, waited. Helen became unhappy about Burke having prostitutes, and an argument broke out. Burke eventually drove Helen out of the house, but Helen began screaming from outside. Brown became uncomfortable and left the lodge, escaping with her life intact.
In June of 1828, Burke crossed paths with an elderly woman and her deaf grandson who were asking for directions. Burke said he would show them the way, but would make a stop at his lodge for rest. When they arrived, the old woman drank whiskey and followed suit to her death, while her grandson was entertained in another room by Helen and Margaret. They argued whether the boy should be set free, as he probably wouldn't drink the whiskey, but feared if they let him go, he would return with authorities who would question them. In the end, they decided to kill him, but instead of smothering him as they had their other victims, they broke his back. Together they sold for 16 pounds.
James Wilson was one of the last victims who was crippled with a bad foot. Wilson was well known around town, and so Hare decided to target him. Wilson asked if Hare had seen his mother, and Hare said he knew where she was and that he should follow him. Burke soon joined them, but the men couldn't seem to get James to drink much. They tried smothering him anyway, but he put up a fight, even pinning down Burke at one point. They eventually suffocated him and sold his body. Soon after, Wilson's mother came looking for him, and many of Dr. Knox's students recognized him, and so Wilson's head and foot were cut off so that they wouldn't get caught.
The last of the victims was Mary Docherty. She was not murdered directly because another couple that went by the name Gray was lodging there, and he didn't want to get caught. Burke convinced the Grays to go stay at Hare's lodging house. The next day, Anne Gray returned to retrieve her stockings, which were laid up by the bed, but was refused. The Greys managed to get into the bedroom and found Doherty's body under the bed, and immediately called the police. Helen bribed them 10 pounds a week to keep quiet, but it was too late. Burke and Hare did manage to remove the body before the police arrived, but many witnesses saw Burke and Hare removing a giant tea chest from the house. The police had little evidence, and when they interrogated Burke and Helen, they found their stories didn't match, and so they arrested them. The police soon found Doherty's body in Knox's classroom.
Burke and Hare were brought in, and Hare was persuaded to give information about Burke in return for his freedom. Burke was convicted and hung in front of 30,000 people in 1829, while Hare left Scotland free of charges.
These acts of murder are one of the events that helped pass the Anatomy Act of 1832. The act was originally designed to stop people such as the resurrectionists, who would dig up the bodies of those recently deceased. The act was actually first proposed in 1828, but it was not passed. After the results of the trial, it was brought up again and passed.
Before the Anatomy Act was passed, the only corpses that could be used for medical research and dissection were those of executed criminals. If you used a body that came to you any other way, it is very likely that you would be arrested. This sort of put scientific research at a standstill.
The Anatomy Act ended the use of cadavers of executed murderers and allowed scientists to use the bodies of those who had passed away in prison or workhouses and were unclaimed.
While this is overall considered a great triumph, at the time, many people disagreed with it. The dissection of your corpse was a feared punishment, even though you had already been killed. Many thought that it was unfair for the impoverished to be submitted to this punishment instead.
The Burke and Hare murders were most definitely a tragedy, but the Anatomy Act that soon followed was a triumph that changed the course of scientific history and expanded our knowledge of the human body.